Welcome back to the third and final video of the Theopenem Getting Started series. In this video, we'll be talking about how to create an image of a computer and deploy it to another machine, or we might call it cloning. If you're familiar with clone deploy, then some of this process may look a little bit familiar to you, as clone deploy has been merged into the Theopenem. All right, let's get started. Begin by opening up your Tomes web interface. And first thing we need to do is configure our COM servers for imaging. Go down and select Admin Settings, Client COM Servers, and we'll select the only COM server that we created in the last two videos. All right, and there we're going to go to Imaging Settings and Upload Interface IP. Here we need to put in the IP address of the COM server. It's the same address we've been using for everything else. Action server. And we'll do the same thing for multicast settings. And finally, the same thing for TFTP settings. I'm not going to be doing any multicasting or any pixie booting in this demo, but these are settings that you will need to enter if you want to do either of those. All right. Now that those are configured, let's go and create an image. First thing we want to do is just sort of create a definition or a placeholder for the image that's going to be uploaded. So we'll select Images and then New. I'll name this Win10 Test. And we'll leave all other options to their defaults. Now we're going to go to our computers. We've only got one. It's the desktop, our VM that we've been using for this video series right here. We're going to assign that image to this machine. Image settings, and we'll do Win10 test, and we'll leave the image profile to the default. There we are. Now this image is assigned to this machine. What we want to do now is actually upload this image from that computer. So all we have to do for that is go to Actions from the computer. So you'll want to do this on the computer that you're going to be uploading from. Again, in this case, we've only got one. We'll view that, Actions, and Upload Image. I will confirm. It says that it successfully started the task. If we go down here to Imaging Tasks, we can see that we have one waiting. It says Task Created for Status. So nothing else has happened yet other than the task has been created, and now we're waiting for the machine to upload. Let's see here. Before we move on, I guess let's make the imaging environment. So this is called, there's actually two imaging environments. We have the Linux imaging environment and the Windows imaging environment. For most people, you're going to stick with the Linux imaging environment. It seems a little strange to use a Linux imaging environment to image Windows, but it just seems to work out a little bit better. Most of this, again, is automated. All we have to do is generate the ISO. To do that, we're going to go down to Settings and PXE/boot menu and ISO/USB boot generator. Once you're here, these options, you're going to leave them all to their defaults. 5.6.4 is the newest kernel. If there's new kernels released, then they'll show up here, and you can regenerate your ISO with a newer kernel. All right, we'll select Actions and Generate ISO. So the ISO, you'll use that to boot your machines. I realize that most computers aren't having CD-ROM drives anymore, so you'll take this ISO and you'll actually use Rufus to copy it to a USB drive and boot that way. I mentioned before that we're not really going to involve TFTP booting in this tutorial. That's because it's not really my favorite way to image. It's not really recommended. It's not as secure. And the secure boot functionality doesn't work with TFTP boot for the Openem, not in general, just specifically for the Openem. Now that our ISO is finished, I'll copy that to my desktop and we'll use that in a minute. All right. Now that that's all set, we'll go prepare our image. Again, this tutorial it's a simple tutorial. I'm not going through the process of setting up your machine, sysprep and answer files and things like that. This is strictly just showing how the Openem works to clone a machine. One thing I will point out is that if you have Toke already installed on your machine, you need to do one of two things. You need to remove it before you take that image, or you need to specify an option to prepare this machine for imaging. And the reason being is that whenever Toke is installed, a unique installation ID is created. So if you clone this machine and put it onto another machine, that installation ID will be the same, and you'll have all kinds of problems. Something that you cannot fix remotely. You'd have to go back and touch every machine, uninstall Toke, and reinstall Toke in order to fix it. So in this example, let me show you how you would prepare image for a machine that's already got Toke installed. If you go to C, Program Files, Toke, and we'll open up PowerShell as administrator here. Actually, before we do this, let me stop the service. Here we are. Now we'll run toke.exe -- prepare image. And that will just basically clear out anything that makes this installation unique. Give that a few minutes. There we are. Once that is done, you need to be sure that's the last thing you do. If you were to reboot this machine before you captured the image, then Toke once again would need to be reset. All right, let's go ahead and shut this down, and we'll pull this image. All right, now that's shut down, I'm going to add the ISO that we created earlier. I'm going to attach it to the virtual DVD drive in here. Again, if this was a physical machine, you'd either use a CD or Rufus to use a USB boot. Apply that. Boot from DVD is already set first. Should be good. Let's see what happens. Here we are. There's our boot menu. We're going to select the Openem. And that's it. The process will start automatically because we've already created the task in the web interface. So as soon as the machine boots into the Linux imaging environment, it checks to see if it has a task, and it does. So it just starts the upload process. So it will go through and pull each partition separately. While this is running, let's hop back over to the web interface and take a look at what's going on there. If we go to our imaging tasks, we can see that this status has changed to imaging. We're on the second partition right now. Some of these partitions are so small that they don't actually really even show up in here. This one got a little bit before it switched to the third. There we are on the third partition, which is going to be the largest with the newest versions of Windows 10. This is now the third partition. Used to be the fourth. So it looks like this is going to take approximately 2 minutes. One thing to note here, if you've used clone deploy in the past, imaging occurred over SMB shares. That is no longer the case. So the uploads, they happen with basically a third-party application manages the transfer for the uploads over UDP ports 9,000 through 10,000. And downloads are going to use just the HTTP or HTTPS if you have that set up. So the advantage to that is no more SMB shares, and that also opens up the ability to image basically anywhere in the world. If you put your COM server in your DMZ, you could essentially serve your images very easily to anyone with this USB device. While this is going for the last minute, let's take a look at how we could use Rufus to create the USB. So again, I'm using a VM, so it was very easy just to attach the ISO to the virtual machine. But if you would want to boot a physical machine, you're going to want to use Rufus. Just do a Google search, look for Rufus, and download a copy of this. It's very easy. All you do is select your ISO, which in our case is the client boot that we downloaded earlier. Your device is going to be your USB drive. And the only thing that you would ever really need to change would be this partition scheme. Now, typically, you can use MBR, and that will handle both EFI and legacy BIOS machines. But every once in a while, you'll get a picky machine that just won't work. Whether it's too old or too new, it may want to be a GPT partition scheme, in which case it would only work for an EFI system. All right, so this would handle both, this one boot device would handle both legacy boot and EFI boot, and it would be compatible with most secure boot systems. Secure boot's getting a little bit tricky. There's been some vulnerabilities later, and they are changing things. So I suspect that some newer machines may not boot with secure boot enabled, or maybe even some really old machines, but anything in the middle should be fine. Once that's all set, all you do is click Start, and it will copy that ISO to your USB, making it bootable. It only takes about 2 minutes, but I'm not going to do that right now. Let's flip back over to our VM, see how we're doing. Okay, looks like it finished. I will turn this off. Go back to our web interface now. Let's take a look at our images. There we are. We've got one Win10 test. It's taking up 6 gigabytes on the server. If we take a look at the image profile, we'll see that it's got a minimum client size of 12 gigs. So that means whatever you deploy this, the hard drive needs to be at least 12 gigabytes. So it compressed it to about half. Let's see here. Another thing to look at is this replication status. Now, if you remember when we talked about COM servers back in the first video, I said you could have multiple to help with load balancing and things like that. So when you do that, the images need to replicate between or among all of the COM servers. In this example, we're only using one COM server, so replication isn't necessary. Otherwise, you would have to wait for those to replicate in order to use the image on every single COM server. The replication, you can take a look at that under Admin Settings and Task Scheduler. The storage sync is what will replicate the image. And it's going to run approximately, every 4.5 hours. Or you could run now if you would like. All right, that should cover uploading the image. So let's deploy this image to another machine. We'll go ahead and create a new VM. Name it Test PC. We'll use an EFI system. And I'll disable dynamic memory. Again, I'll use my internal network. Default hard drive. And of course, we've got an error here. File exists. Looks like I've already done this once before. Let's name this test PC1. All right, we'll configure this to boot up to our client boot ISO. Add a DVD. Apply that, and I will set the DVD's first boot device. Now, if you've ever messed around with Hyper-V, you know its secure boot is a little bit strange. They've actually got Microsoft Windows and the Microsoft EFI CA. This one here, the UEFI Certificate Authority, is basically what you would find on a physical machine. So if you want to keep secure boot on while you're imaging and Hyper-V, you have to select UEFI Certificate Authority. All right, let's boot this up. Once again, we'll select Theopenem. So this time you'll see this screen is a little bit different. If you remember when we uploaded the image, we never saw this. It just immediately started uploading because we'd already created the task in the web interface. But for this machine, it doesn't actually exist in the Theopenem. We just created it. So we're going to register it manually from this client console. So we'll name this machine Test PC. And we're going to do something called an on-demand task. This basically lets you deploy an image without going through the web interface if you have not started a task. So if I go over to the web interface real quick, you'll see there's no computer under search active because Toke has not been run on this test PC, but it will show up under image only. And from here, we could assign an image and deploy it through the web interface. Again, I'm going to do everything through this client console just to show you both ways. We will deploy. We've got one image. And it's just the same as the upload process now, but in the opposite direction. So we'll give this a few minutes to deploy. See if we can find anything else in the web interface to demo. See, we still have our active task for test PC. Let's take a look at our image once again. There's a few things in here that may be useful for you to learn. The image profile is probably one of the most important things, which controls how the image will upload or deploy. Generally, you can just go with the defaults, but if you wanted to change some things, this is where you would do it at. For example, deploy options. This is automatically going to change the computer name. We could turn that off if we wanted to. There's some other things in here. This one here is pretty important, the create partitions method. This essentially controls which computers you can deploy to based on its size, its hard drive size. Dynamic, for example, will resize everything, and that way you can deploy the image to various size hard drives, smaller or bigger, as long as the space is available. One thing that we did not cover specifically, again, was actually preparing this image, sysprep, generalizing it, things like that. You can, with the Theopenem, actually make one universal image. That's typically how I do it. I'll create one Windows 10 image in my Hyper-V VM, and I can use that. I could deploy to both EFI and legacy BIOS, and I can inject the drivers during imaging, and it just makes it very simple. And the way you would do that is by changing this partition method to standard on the deploy. And what that does is it just detects the type of machine that you're using, and if it's an EFI machine, it creates EFI partition table, and if it's legacy BIOS, it will create a legacy BIOS partition table, and all the other things that are required to make it bootable. Just creating the partition table isn't enough. It needs to do some other steps to make it bootable, and that is also all handled by the Theopenem. That's a tutorial I do want to make in the future here, a universal imaging guide, essentially, how to make one image to deploy it to any machine, EFI, legacy BIOS, including the drivers. So maybe in the next couple weeks or a few months before I get to that one. And it looks like we're on the fourth partition here. This should be finishing up momentarily. Once that's done, let's remove our DVD. Well, we can actually keep it. Let's just move our hard drive up to the first boot device. And once again, with this being Hyper-V, the secure boot is kind of funny. Windows won't actually boot with this one. You have to change it back to Microsoft Windows. And let's see if it boots up. And it looks like we were successful. So we've cloned our original VM to a new one. And we registered this computer with the name test PC in the Theopenem. It should have renamed it for us. And there we are, test PC. Rename was successful. We didn't have to do anything extra, just did it automatically. The VM, sometimes the time can get messed up in these VMs. So I'll need to fix this before the Toke client will work. If your time is if your server time and your client time don't match, you're going to have some issues with Toke. It won't be authorized. It'll think it's a replay attack and will just deny the request. There we go. And let's go back to our web interface and see if anything's changed in there. All right, we don't have any new computers yet. Let's give it a minute. There we are. So once I fixed the time on that VM, this computer showed up. No problems. Now here's where it gets a little bit strange. If we go to search image only, you'll see the test PC is still here. The reason for that is because we haven't collected the inventory yet on this new machine. So if we go back to our test PC and collect the inventory, once this hardware UUID is filled in, that's when they will be combined into a single machine. Oops. There we go. Hardware UUID is now here. Let's go back to our computers, and our image only is now gone. So if we go back to our test PC and look at our imaging history, it's not there. I'll have to look into that one. All right, folks, that should do it. That's the end of the Getting Started video series for the Openem. I'll be making some new videos on some advanced topics and some other tutorials. If you have any suggestions, go ahead and leave them in the comments, and I'll get some other videos made. Until then, I'll see you later.